Hello, I'm Dr. Catherine Beck, and I'm the author of Patronage in the British Navy, 1775 to 1815. This book is a deep dive into naval patronage, or what we could otherwise call the highly personal and sometimes contradictory system of connection, obligation, and guarantee that fundamentally shapes society, as well as underpinned naval employment, promotion, and support at this time of the Navy's huge growth and great societal change at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. This system was really the water that 18th century people swam in. You can dip into almost any 18th century archive and you'll likely stumble across some kind of patronage, whether it's as explicit as a direct application to a elite patron for their favour and support, or much more subtle, like a casual request tagged onto the end of a letter between close friends. And the Navy at this pivotal time at the end of the 18th century is really interesting and an important place to look at patronage, because not only did the wars with America and France cause the Navy to explode in size, but also sailing an 18th century ship did require skill. So this binary that people sometimes have in mind when we think about patronage, so was someone selected because of their merit or because of who their family and friends are, it becomes really quite murky, which allows us to dig into it as a system which wasn't just the preserve of the social elite, but actually extended throughout all levels of society. I became interested in patronage because we can't really understand naval employment without understanding this complicated web of connections like friendships and mentorships, as well as these other factors of trust and feelings of obligation or indebtedness or duty that really made it work. I've always been drawn to studying maritime spaces because there's pressures to a life at sea, like the closeness of people of different social levels on board a ship, and also things like global mobility, which created strong bonds between shipmates, but also meant that people had to use letters to keep in touch with friends, family, and employers, like at the Admiralty back home. And this really exposes aspects of 18th century society which we don't always get to see. In fact, one of the main things that prompted me to write this book was the really fantastic collection of the papers of Admiral John Markham that the National Maritime Museum acquired in 2013. This collection really forms the spine of the book because John Markham served as one of the Lord Commissioners of the Admiralty twice, between 1801 and 1807. And his collection is full of letters, not just from admirals or socially elite correspondents, but from hundreds of ordinary captains and lieutenants, midshipmen, masters, pursers, carpenters, as well as their wives, sisters, and families. With Markham's collection, we can see the similarities and differences that existed between more socially elite members of the Navy and much more ordinary people. And it gives a kind of cross-section of society that makes it very obvious that patronage was a social system that extended right across social levels and was not just something that was important in the lives of the social elite. And this is especially clear when we look at how the patterns that we see in Markham's papers also existed in the networks of ordinary workers and shipwrights in the royal dockyards, which I look at in the final chapter of the book. So, lots of people and historians, as well as quite a few people at the time, thought of patronage as a kind of corruption. And it's possible to see why this was in a lot of ways. At its bare essentials, patronage is the use of personal connection to act as a guarantee within the distribution of appointments and social support. Because of this, many contemporary writers as well as historians have framed it as a kind of corruption because of the way a person could draw on well-placed friends, or their power as a member of parliament or as a member of the social elite of British society to what looks like circumvent what we may see as superior or fairer meritocratic systems of employment and progress in your life or career. Especially in the Navy, where vacancies for positions like for lieutenant were often very scarce, and good candidates could easily be passed over in favour of those whose ability and connections offered both merit and security to somebody like John Markham, who had the power to make appointments. One man's seemingly moral patronage inevitably seemed corrupt to another. Collections like Markham's papers at the National Maritime Museum are so valuable to us because the mobility of so many people serving in the Navy and often the distance of their family members from the Admiralty meant that people put into writing what would often happen face to face in normal 18th century society. Face-to-face meetings helped to strengthen the relationships which patronage was built upon and gave a chance to build the trust that patronage needed to work, especially for applicants from lower down the social scale who were approaching more elite patrons like John Markham, with whom they might have had fewer mutual connections and so needed to work much harder to prove their reputation and earn that trust. Because of the role of face-to-face meetings, patronage generally leaves an incomplete historical record. Informal conversations over dinner in the drawing room, on board ship, in portside inns, or even in government offices like at the Admiralty don't leave the same kind of historical footprint that a letter does. So in this book, I mainly look in detail at the letters that stood in place of these face-to-face meetings, digging into how men and women up and down the social scale presented themselves to Markham as, for instance, his constituent when he was a member of Parliament at Portsmouth, or as an anxious parent, or as Markham's friend, or even sometimes as strangers writing to him because he had a reputation for being honest and fair in how he distributed appointments. But I also needed to address the gaps left in the record by the importance of these face-to-face meetings. So as well as looking at these direct solicitation letters or applications, I also built outwards by reconstructing the networks that surrounded Markham, as well as others in situations outside the Admiralty, like among shipwrights in the Royal Dockyards, to try to create a picture of some of these other potential avenues of patronage access and support. In doing this, I've been able to include some players who are not traditionally considered in the story of naval patronage. One of the best things about writing this book is that I have so many stories to choose from to answer this question. We have cases like the carpenter Russell White, who wrote to Markham for assistance as his friend because he served with him as his messmate over 25 years earlier when Markham first joined the Navy, aged just 15. Or we have Mary Higg, who was the owner of a portside inn at Plymouth, who seems to have been connected to Markham through a convoluted series of family and friendships that reached even through networks at the University of Oxford. Or maybe she just knew him from when he stayed in her inn, but either way, she recommended her friends to Markham for employment, as well as doing other kinds of things to strengthen her friendly connection to him, like, according to one letter, sending him some pilchards. And then there's also cases like Lieutenant Daniel Carpenter, who was not who we might consider to be a particularly successful officer in terms of promotion, but Markham supported him throughout his time at the Admiralty, making sure he remained employed as he wanted, not in large ships where he might get the chance of proving himself in some big action and get promoted to post captain, but instead in smaller vessels, which offered him a steadier income and a slightly higher wage so that he could support his family. Or then there's Daniel's wife Harriet, who wrote to Markham from on board her husband's ship to tell him that it was leaky and needed to be refitted, and who drew on her wifely anxiety to ask Markham to ensure her husband got a new ship if this happened, because Daniel did not feel he had a right to ask Markham for any more favours or even mention the state of the ship he had been appointed to in case he seemed entitled or ungrateful. And I found it extremely rewarding to look at some of these non-traditional players in naval patronage, especially looking at women and applicants who seem to have less advantages than the people we usually consider when we think about patronage. In fact, sometimes having a lot of influence and explicitly using that power on Markham seems to have backfired for some people. In chapter 3, one of the things I look at is how a great sense of entitlement from well-connected applicants often had the opposite effect on Markham than we might expect, if we believe a narrative of 18th century patronage in which the social and political elite really just had their way most of the time. The growing size of the Navy meant that someone like Markham had to deal with many requests, and he often couldn't help even those he wanted to help, least of all those he felt threatened to help because of their powerful connections. Instead, he seems to have really preferred to help people like Daniel and Harriet Carpenter, who he found both to be deserving of his support and less demanding or risky if he offended them by being unable to fulfill a request. So one thing I really hope that readers can take away from this book is how varied patronage could be and how it was influenced by all kinds of factors, not just how powerfully connected an applicant was with the social and political elite of 18th century Britain. Uncovering lower level patronage networks has really proved to me the value of considering the focal points of patronage that existed throughout society, rather than merely judging degrees of access to elite control. And when we think about patronage as a system based on trust as well as obligation, we can see how involved many different players were in the process, as well as see much more clearly the sorts of barriers that people in less advantageous positions actually faced, rather than just assuming people lower down the social scale did not understand or were excluded from patronage, or assuming that when women tended to couch most of their patronage dealings in the language of friendship, it meant that they were not involved in maintaining vital relationships or making more risky requests on behalf of their male relatives.